Oh man, welcome to Seattle for the next live edition of the podcast. And we have a repeat podcast host, Spencer, here all the way 3,000 miles away from home base. So, Spencer, thanks for coming back on.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So, I actually thought an interesting topic to talk about with you would be the sustainability realm of things and when the design community is looking for sustainable paths when it comes to material selection, material procurement, and trying to follow guidelines like LEED. I don't even know if there really are like paths to comply from a code standpoint. But I think this is a topic that's a little bit conflated and there's a lot of mixed messaging around, especially with your experience. This is why I wanted to touch on it with you is from the aluminum sourcing world, especially in your Schuko days, how you would classify things like the recyclability and what was the term that was common to use, like end-to-end sourcing or
Well, like life cycle analysis,
yeah.
kind of common.
So just talking about like material selection, and especially selecting your facade assemblies and systems, how architects can sort of think about this from a different perspective in terms of like what are the big driving factors that really move the needle versus what's probably not getting you very far.
I think what's important anytime we discuss sustainability in facades, you have to frame it categorically in what your targets are, right? Obviously, we could go into the energy, conservation and performance of the assemblies, talking about thermal efficiencies and whatnot. But on a material selection basis, I think you have kind of an emerging focus in the industry right now that's really exciting around like the carbon footprint of the material. And with aluminum, this is especially sensitive because aluminum is so energy intensive to produce and then also to process. And in our industry, working with extruded aluminum, it's incredibly energy intensive. And, relative to other materials that could be used as a facade, enclosure, it's on the higher end of the spectrum. Really, the only way to address this fundamentally is to look at the point source energy for your material supply chain. And that's pretty limited depending on where the material is coming from. In the past, working with European extruders, there's really big initiatives to track and quantify that supply chain so that you can essentially buy an aluminum extrusion from a facade manufacturer or wholesale distribution company, and then they provide verification and a certificate that says, here's where this was extruded, here's the point source energy used. We can verify that that energy source was from a certain percentage of kind of renewable energy generation, or here's the carbon footprint that comes out of that if it was a non-renewable source. And that's something that is really, I think, emerging in the industry here in the United States. It's pretty exciting, but it's also a bit daunting. I'm certainly not an expert in the topic. There's other people in the industry who are doing a lot of good work in this direction. But it is part of the sustainability discussion now that we're having, like a more contemporary discussion.
Well, yeah, I'm sure this is something that was brought up when you were in school in Europe. And like you just said, it's the sourcing of the material and then, how well performing can you get the assembly to be to lower your operational carbon, but also the energy source as well, where you're sourcing your energy from in the grid. And it's like all these factors when it comes to durability, maintainability, life cycle of the facade. There's this constant push and pull.
Yeah.
And I feel like you're always going to have to compromise in one area to benefit in another.
It's interesting that, we talk about the life cycle of a building, right? And the building enclosure is kind of paramount in that discussion because the performance of your facade in a lot of ways defines like how relevant the building is to like contemporary requirements, whether it's user comfort or code compliance or energy efficiency. And what's really, I think, a low-hanging fruit for the facade industry, separate from evaluating the material supply chain, which is really important, is looking at this concept of adaptability, right? And kind of future-proofing the building through intelligent design. And this is something that is really, in a lot of ways, dependent on the client and the project, what their time horizon is for, usage and, ownership of the building. But I think it's something that when I say is low-hanging fruit, it can be solved through intelligent system design, right? It's very easy to approach the topic of adaptability and future-proofing if you get into, the design of the project and assign that as like a tenet of the outcome that you're trying to achieve. If it's an actual goal that you're going to say, okay, I want to have this facade where we can replace the glass easily in the future to accommodate a higher performing product, or we have the ability to disassemble the facade entirely with minimal, destruction to material, minimal waste generation, right? With the goal of then improving the performance of the facade in the future through additional insulation or remediation efforts that maybe improve the overall performance in terms of like water infiltration resistance. These are things that in a lot of ways are kind of counter to I think some of the priorities that we have on like a product design basis generally in the industry, right? Normally we're very focused on maintaining low costs for like upfront costs and also simplifying the installation. And what you find when you get into the design of adaptability, installation methods may not be as easy than if you just had like a more, like permanent solution in the sense that it's something you put on the building once and then it's very hard to disassemble without demolishing, the facade. But there are definitely means and methods to achieve this. And I think that, there isn't necessarily, as far as I know, like a core metric industry-wide that's like a code compliance item around adaptability. It's more about like architects and consultants specifying this as like a criteria on top of whatever would be in place for code compliance or some other sustainability target that maybe has a better defined use case.
And do you think it's interesting? I was actually with an architect in the Midwest in more of a heating dominated climate yesterday or 2 days ago, and there was a lot of pushback around triple glazing, just around the thought of the cost increase. And I was like, I don't push that aside. They were trying to comply with LEED. And I think there was this thought process or initiative that getting additional LEED points meant a more sustainable building and a better outcome. And I think there's been some discussion on this topic and disagreement around the effectiveness of some of that. And I think the design community is trying to make more informed decisions, but I think the decision-making framework is somewhat limited in terms of maybe a little bit of knowledge sharing and understanding what's out there, but also understanding where they can really move the needle and what they're ultimately really trying to achieve.
Yeah, I mean, I think LEED, it's something that I think has faced a lot of criticism, since its inception around like what's an effective implementation of sustainability, in architecture, right? And we can debate that kind of ad nauseum, like where the real priority is, coming at it from the climate change perspective. Obviously, energy efficiency is like paramount above like bike racks, right? But bike racks are still really important, and I think that maybe one high level way to look at this is that LEED has definitely provided a vehicle to bring multiple topics that you could define as, related to sustainability into the discourse and also provide a framework to like really implement them and track them, which I think is super important, and there are other standards that are kind of coming online as, additional possible like compliance paths to achieving like energy performance goals, or even now with California looking at implementing like carbon footprint tracking on certain materials in the buildings based on their code requirements. It evolves slowly. I think that LEED still definitely has like, it's kind of like a cornerstone to the industry when we talk about sustainability, right? It's not the end all be all. It's not where we're going to land eventually, but it's definitely like foundational to implementing a lot of these strategies. And I think it's been pretty effective in that way. And the criteria is evolving. This is the most important thing, right? It's not static criteria. So, as we move into these other focuses of sustainability, I think it's not like too far-fetched to think that like LEED will eventually incorporate a lot of these topics as we go further.
Given your sort of experience or expertise in unitized curtain wall to sort of round this out, what is one change moving forward you'd really like to see more of in terms of newer designs? I see some like double skin facades or ventilated facades coming out on the market, stuff that we would have seen as somewhat commonplace in Europe. What's one thing that you wish you'd see more of here domestically in the unitized world?
Yeah, I think fundamentally it's this idea of future-proofing through like ability to disassemble facades without demolition. I think that's really important because there's always a requirement generally in especially unitized facades, with a lot of glazing, that you have ease of glass replacement, right? And that's one piece of this. And it's probably in a lot of cases the biggest piece, right? Because we get improvements in the glass packages through, improved material science and product developments in that industry, which we can then directly apply to what we're doing. And IGUs have a shelf life, right? Like they don't last forever, right? They have a point of kind of diminishing performance, so they need to be replaceable in the future. But I think if we look beyond that, there's definitely like a greater life cycle analysis that you can evaluate a facade from. That's not just about the degradation of the IGU, but it's more about, the perimeter sealants, the framing system itself, right? Which, for the viability of an extruded piece of aluminum is quite long relative to the operational use of a building. But having the ability to disassemble a facade and upgrade opaque areas of the building, I think is critical, as we get to a point where codes are getting more and more aggressive. And as we look at kind of holistically improving the performance of buildings, the facade is the low-hanging fruit to do that. And if you have the ability to go back to an existing building, upgrade it, from the perspective of energy efficiency, you're now improving the life cycle, equation for that building, right? And you're minimizing the waste. And I think that's really critical. You look at a lot of these projects that we're doing in big cities, which are office to residential conversion. That is such a great opportunity in that moment where you're going to be, demoing a lot of the existing facade. Look to the future of what is this actually going to be able to do 20 years, 30 years out? And how are you going to have to come back and address that, when the codes change or when you want to improve the efficiency even more than what's required today? So, like I said, it's in my mind, there's definitely added complexity on a system design level, but I think it's something that we can start doing right away, like as an industry. It's really just a hot take, though.
So maintainability of curtain walls, not just focusing on the vision area, but also spandrel area. Great takeaway. Thanks for coming on, Spencer.
Yeah, thank you.